What is art direction? Whether for brand content or personal content, the difference between great creative and mediocre creative lies in the art direction. This video, I'm gonna hit what it is, and I'm gonna go through 100 examples from my favorite references and talk about why they work and then how you can use them yourself. This video is both great to learn the concepts of how to think about art direction and to look back on as a reference for any campaign or anything you do to generate ideas, because we just have tons of them throughout. Art direction is zoned in on the visual production of photo and video assets, whereas creative direction looks at the overall themes across everything a brand has to do. Since we have so much more content to make as individuals, as creators, as brands, and it's become a non-stop churn of content that has to come out, art direction has become a part of the toolkit that every creator and creative needs to have. So diving right into the examples, I'm going to walk through a large amount of different types of brands within this. We're going to go through jewelry brands, food brands, fashion brands, all kinds of different categories. You can find applicableness to whatever it is you're working on and to yourself as an individual for what you document. So this is from a jewelry brand called Hernan Herdes. I'm actually wearing one of their chains right now. They're one of my faves, and what drew me to them was their art direction. Every photo has an intentional, interesting thought. So whether it's presenting their jewelry wrapped in asparagus or attached to bread, what we see here with this leaning tower of glassware, whatever we have going on with these hands, every single photo has an idea behind it. Instead of saying, I'm going to just make a beautiful photo of this, put it on white, put it on a basic background, there is a concept behind every single thing you see. And the intention has been put into that. And that is a core of the art direction. It separates the photo from not. Is this just a person standing or sitting there? Is it just a headshot? Is it just someone in some natural background? Are we just documenting or getting something candid? Are we shooting something basic? Or do we have an idea? And that presence of an idea can give your photography, videography, whatever it is, something special. And then you begin to develop motifs and the identity of your brand that revolves around some of these special ideas recurring and mixing with each other. And all of this helps in its success. It helps on social media feeds, because things like this stand out, resonate, become shareable, commentable in a way that more basic content doesn't. And second, it resonates with the consumer. It makes them think for even a second. It gives them a bit of an understanding of what the brand might stand for. And for instance, for me, for this brand, these particular kind of like artful displays of it really made it stand out to me. It was something that resonated with me as a consumer and how they were presented to make me look at the brand further. And art direction doesn't have to be complex. This is a standard shot you could see of any jewelry brand where you have a manicured hand with the jewelry on it, but by putting the glove on it, they've just added one thing. And if you're thinking about art direction for the first time, or you're thinking, how can I incorporate this in shoots when I have a lot of oversight and I don't have some big budget, the minimum requirement for art direction is just select one thing you're adding to your shoot, that you're adding to this piece of content that is going to make it somewhat interesting or special or different. And for instance, this glove didn't cost any more than they would put it to a normal photo shoot, but it transforms this photo in an interesting way. Another example here of not just showing the model, but showing the model's head coming through an orifice, for lack of a better term. And this ties a bit into how can you use these things for your own brand. And so, for instance, if you want to look at an idea or look at art direction or any of the references I have here, you put it on your mood board. What do you actually do with it? And so this is a great example where, look, I don't work super in depth on any jewelry currently, but this concept of someone coming out of a space or coming out of an odd space is a concept that I would put down like inside my Notion like brainstorm I have for art direction. And it's an idea I can come back to and say, for whatever shoot it is, I'd be shooting headwear. Like, how can I find a space like this or a portal of sorts that is on brand for what I work on? For instance, obviously my valuable brand has a lot of car themes on it. I look at this and I go, great, for one of these hat shots I'm doing, I need to be shooting the model's head coming out of like the passenger window, like they're hollering or whatever it is. And all of a sudden this becomes a transplant of it I put into the context of my brand. So you think about that one different thing, head coming out of a scenario, and you go, what scenarios make sense for my brand to put them into? And you can even go one degree removed to what do I actually have access to? And you can list out the items and things you have that make your brand special or that you have access to in your studio or in your life, and begin to work around that. So this is another example of the jewelry displayed resembling a face. Part of what really drew me to the brand, this kind of recurring series they have. And that's what I love about the idea of art direction, one-off versus working for as a brand or a series. You're going to develop motifs as a brand and your trademarks as a creative. And you're going to find things like this that resonate, you love to do, you have some theories to do that you repeat. And these are the through lines that create brands visually embedded in people's subconscious over time, where you see that and you immediately think of the brand. And whether someone else does it or not, if they think of you, then that begins to have, you've built your brand standard to a certain level. And I'm going to show some exact creative directors and some of their work across brands and how they have some of those through lines and how they work. And so worth thinking about, what are those statements for, and as you look back, if you've already done a bunch of work like this and you're an art director trying to brand yourself, think about where your future lies, look back at the work you've done and go, what is the most successful things, most exciting things, the things I like the most, or the through lines I have? And then how do I lean into that? How do I make that a trademark part of what I do? How do I become associated with it? It's part of the visual branding that goes both for a brand and works just as well for an individual creative. And leaning into those through lines and adding new ones, retiring old ones, or adding variations is part of what gives you an arc that's memorable as a creative. Possibly my favorite of all those. So speaking of arcs as a creative, this image is by Eraser Worldwide. And this is a high production image. This has some serious cost to get this many people and actually do this edit style, and maybe not cost, but certainly time. I believe Racer is from Estonia. They do an excellent job of having cemented themselves as kind of a counterculture, Estonia representing, like chaotic brand. And they're obviously standing out with some iconography. They're not a religious brand. If anything, I'd argue they might be anti that. But it creates conversation in what they do. But when you look at the creative director of this shoot, there's something I love to do is go, if they do credit, go check it out. So we went and check out Anna. You get to see that all the way back in 2016, she'd worked on this. So it's obviously part of her kind of toolkit, her aesthetic is being able to portray bodies overhead in scenarios and in symbolism. And that's a really interesting through line for someone to have. And it's one of the things that has gone now, it is 8 years between those two campaigns, but continues to be a thing that is present in her work and something she knows how to do and execute. So that was jewelry. Now we're going to dive into more common objects like drinks. This is going to be useful for basically anything that has a container. So if you sell glassware, if you sell anything that is kind of like a home good, and also you sell any beverage of any kind. Some of these examples are going to be really... So Gia, excellent creative direction of this brand overall. Visuals are always on point. And you've seen them probably in my website video. I brought this up before. But these photos of their product, they have recipes as a core content that they do. And each of these are shot in this incredible fashion. They have that perfect haze over them. I think they have lights are added in post. Or if they're in camera, good for them. But they've created this visual style where they are styling each one of these beverages. And when you have something like Gia, where you have a handful of cans, there's only so much you can do as far as showing your product in a certain way. There's an infinite amount of variations you have when you show it in a glass and styled in a glass, from the matter of the color they chose with the olives, with the glass that happens there. They have an infinite number of content and art combinations that come from this, all shot in a signature style. And this is something, in my last Cut 30 cohort that I did, we had a glassware company in there that sold really nice ornate glasses. And they were always making content around their glasses, but I was noticing there was never everything in the glass. And so one person I brought up was this woman, Bevs by Beverly, who does recipe content online. And what stood out about her content, and what makes it resonate really well, is it's always shot. This is always like golden hour lighting. So it's really intentional around what the lighting looks like and having it be what I believe is real light. But the presentation of the visual look of both the simple glasses with the visually intense recipes, everything has an intention around the glass that's used, whether it's for actually creating the recipe or presenting it, and the intentional light and framing of how this is put together. And her art direction of these shoots is what makes it stand out from other recipe content that's on there. But again, if you are a company that has any type of beverage whatsoever, then being able to create something aesthetic like this is a surefire win for content. Also, if you are any container of this, especially you make glass or you make any table good, being present or around this, any ingredient from this, you are taking what you have and adding on a whole aesthetic world on top of it. I think that's a really powerful concept to think through and allows you to make more common objects into much more interesting content. And so going to fashion, where you tend to have the best examples of this, House of Errors, relatively newer brand, one you probably see me wear a decent amount. They've had basically every shoot they've ever released has been really intentionally thought, whether they're using on the higher budget end of this. And I want to show a whole range of this on depending what kind of brand you are. Things you can do simply, just with attention, things you can do if you're already doing shoots in Elevated, or things you can do if you're going to spend money, time, and resources. And they're a great example of, look, they're hiring actors and models for these campaigns. These are out of the box ones. They're putting them in the unique scenarios. They're having great creatives capture the content. And everything is conceptual. The locations are incredible. When they are the locations, the thought through of how they interact. And I have a whole little section here about how people interact. This is just a great example of, like, if you have two guys standing there, what are they going to do? How do you make it stand out? Like a headbutt is certainly a interesting one, especially when it's presented in context of the other images there where you have like a mountain. And again, I don't know how they're accomplishing this image, but you're taking something relatively normal and making it stand out. You're leveraging your location to the fullest, all the way to just like completely ornate, fully expensive produced shoots, to what you can do in post with editing, to even the basics of like this shot could be anywhere, but the intention of the lighting and the outfit and what he's doing, again, with the light source coming and him looking towards it, it just has a lot of implied story without having to do too much. To one of their best shoots that I've looked at, it's called it was Black Friday market drop or something like that, where they're playing on the financial crisis stock drop back before. Yeah, it took a lot of people to go execute and do something like this, but an immaculately thought through and concepted shoot, executed with like full budget and intention. And I think how standout this image and campaign was and how popular it was for them and how many people showed it, and the fact that like Outlander is taking the time to like post their content and boost their brand, shows when you do take things this seriously, the power it has for your brand. If my voice is fading here, I've been sick all week, I apologize, but the value will still be in the content, I promise. And I may even try to put captions on this video. We'll see if I want to dig through 20 minutes of editing that. We'll see. Another example, Bad Sun. This is a great example of like, I don't think this brand has huge budgets for this kind of stuff. This is an incredible image and it's comped. They show you it's comped. You know, for what I can tell, this is a 3D model, or like the base of the 3D model that they use to create this. But you're able to create one person, move them around in space in Blender or whatever they're using here, and they created something like purely off of the concept. But another thing I liked here is them presenting the images in a format. So for instance, they have like this lookbook presented on CD-ROM, and that's a fascinating way to think about, we're going to capture images, and then we're going to present them like in another format. We're going to comp them into something and doing it in an interesting way and displaying it even the way they chose to have multiple or versus putting it in the case or wherever you choose. And then also taking that art direction, then putting it across other things. So for instance, like they have the pricing and the size charts portrayed in the same fashion. And this is an interesting thing to think about, is when you do these kind of things for these shoots, how can you extend them? So if you've done it for that concept, can you add that to your product detail page? Can you then include that in whatever manual you have? How can you extend your art direction concepts as through lines throughout other things you do for the brand? Some of those things that enter into like the creative direction that is the brand intangibles that really make things resonate. Speaking of big budget, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Jacquemus, who have just done a series of these launches, and they often use oversized items as part of it. So they're announcing a new location here. They have all these big oversized items created. This is incredible content, perfect for social media. I think it's one of the most common winning techniques still now. Just go make bigger versions of things you sell or viral things on here. They do a lot of that. They had a successful postcard in their previous campaign, which was just a few weeks ago for another store opening, all the way to like this large map that they have here, the branding on it. Like the large item is a part of the motif of their art direction. But equally as much is these kind of like outrageous scenarios, like my guy ironing on the stand-up paddleboard and an inflatable, you know, it's got that balance, to this idea of her enjoying a cocktail on a chair being transported between locations. And what I like about showing this contrast is that this is something that requires some degree of production. It's actually probably cheaper than you think to go get this printed out. Like, I love art direction ideas you can execute for a couple $100. Like, right? Like, this didn't take, maybe they have models here where you could do it with your team. Printing that map alone is a thing that costs a couple $100 and you can execute content. You could have this image, you could have it be a bump shot where people are kind of using it to navigate. You get people something out. There's a way to create that into a reel or a piece of content that should be able to manufacture good views for you. You can take a couple stabs at because you can do that content where you show the behind the scenes and then show the reality. There's a way to do multiple iterations every time you use this. It has a couple $100, and that is the sweet spot for new brands, especially, or people that need to get creative, or people that need to make content like every week where you can actually afford it and it pays for itself. But overall, these ideas where it's like, all right, like the stand-up paddleboard, the ironing board, the guy out there on an iPhone video is very achievable for him. This is a conceptual look. If you know anyone that has a stand-up paddleboard, if you have an ironing board, you know, this isn't some crazy outfit this person has on. Separate than this, like this is something that's executable. Then to a lesser extent, getting something like this done, but obviously the impact can potentially be higher. All the way to more silly stuff like this still is eye-catching for the internet. And again, to a more expensive scenario, but they are, you know, doing the ultimate end of this, where this is one carousel. It's the entire use of this for them. And they're taking 10 shots at having a viral item inside what they put together, because they have the maximum resources to be able to go execute something like this. That shows you how serious they take it. Is they're like, we want to make sure we are destined for success here, and we want to get our 544,000 fucking likes, which is insane. And we are going to go hit 10 shots, and every one of them cost money and time and production, and it was totally worth it. And you can do this with studio shots and things as well. So Bandit, We'd interviewed them in our Hyper newsletter, interviewed their creative director, I believe he's one of the co-founders, Tim, in there. And he had talked about they're doing these studio shoots, and they're like comping these backgrounds in. Sometimes the backgrounds are generated with AI. And I always think that that's an interesting approach to be able to take some normal things you're doing and you have to get some nuance to be able to kind of color match things correctly, but it's impactful on the feed and more subtle. All right, switching gears a bit. This is a vape brand, and they're utilizing viral items. This is another interesting thing that a lot of brands can do. So this is a whole carousel of tabbies that are holding their product. And so another good example of you don't have some beautiful aesthetic product, you have something more normal, leverage more viral things around it to help it succeed. And this is a great little art direction choice for a social carousel there. That is just kind of like a fun idea. And they're in a restricted category, so you're always gonna have a hard time with social media. But I'm gonna show a bunch of like restricted category stuff because they tend to have to try to do as well as they can organically because they're limited on what they can do paid. So another great example, the brand Pure Beauty, just a purely excellent art-directed brand all around. And they have this kind of like, they're showing their product in this like almost quasi fetish scenario that just makes it a standout photo. But I want to show another good example. This is a brand that doesn't have some hugely compelling thing to look at every time it's in a photo. This is a large version of the small box that their product comes in. So they made like a shoebox size version, probably not that expensive, but is akin to what they've already created here. And they now present it in multiple different scenarios as a recurring motif in their art direction. Again, presented here. And so if you do have a product where, again, it's not some crazy aesthetic thing, you don't have tons of variations, doing something like this where you say, whether it's the actual product itself or an oversized version of it or an undersized version of it, and putting in scenarios is an art direction strategy in itself. I also love this shot here. I love art direction that adds in the concept of like, what are people doing every day, but just make it slightly off. Like this here, like he's watering the pool, where it's just conceptual. And again, something that doesn't require a huge budget. This is just purely a concept. All the way to more orchestrated product shots where, macro shot, super wide, the way it's styled, they have created a really particular look and feel. And another approach, I'm using their example, but if you had a more standard brand, the idea if you're going to take their branding and you're going to apply photography of the things that happen in the background of the brand, but make it really elevated photography like they're doing here with the soil that they use in the product. If you're trying to storytell for a company that doesn't have things that are beautiful, capturing beautiful imagery of the everyday things that happen and then having a branding application is an interesting art direction method. Quick tangent on related to it is this brand Margin, who I'm about to show some examples of what they've done. They've basically incorporated art into their packaging. So there'll be this kind of like limited art that's available like on side what they print and release, which I think is a fun concept that when I did my packaging survey with Hyper, where we had like 600 people talk about, what kind of packaging they like. And a lot of people were interested in like art and editions and recurring series and what the new thing is. Think of like Jones Soda, people like that. And I think that they're an interesting brand that's kind of done this in they're like a smaller cosmetics brand. But I think that's something to think about as well is when you're thinking your packaging look like, is there an art direction component or a recurring component to that? So a cool example of a Margin shoot here is what they've done here. So they're basically, their cream is just applied to this Letterman. And it doesn't make sense. It doesn't have reason, but it's gorgeous and it's impactful and it's thoughtful in a way that I think really speaks to a certain customer type. And this is the kind of out-of-the-box thinking I feel is good for brands that do have something that's really common, like skincare, where it's like, how do I look at this in any other way? And even just putting it in a foreign, complex scenario, artfully executed, gives it that degree that's just better than yet another product shot. But then I hunted down Michael, who took this shot. And so this is part of his recurring motifs as an art director, is he has tools, the way you saw previously and you see here, interacting with more common products. And that's a really fun, interesting, recurring theme for a creative to have that he's developed into his toolkit. Another shot from him I love, which would be a cool for any, again, kind of brand that you have here, is you're taking your product and attaching it to something that is an inherently more interesting image. Briefly, to talk about like the art direction of a carousel overall. Like this is a great just example if you're shooting a product shot and you're like intentional around like the colors and backgrounds, like having that match here on something this strong really helps it pop. And they're tying that to these like ingredient shots, to macro of the product. Like the ability to create a carousel and kind of think through some of that storylining is a key part of the toolkit. Another from that brand Rose, it'd be cool for all kind of food brands or brands with ingredients, is the way they have these peppers incorporated here, like in the shot, and the ability, I'm swinging back and forth between two photos in the carousel right now. But like really showing that background and ingredients process that goes into it is what this brand Rose does well. Where obviously if they were just taking pictures of these gummies all the time, that wouldn't be as impactful as what we're seeing in the mixer, them on top of a collage. The ability to kind of put product and process next to each other is a bit of art direction in itself. Tools of presentation is a whole thing there as well, where it's just a choice of what you're using to hold a product, or like the uniqueness of like the cutlery choice you have if you're at a table or whatever it is a big thing that can help separate concepts apart. Now I want to do a quick dive into one of the goats of art direction, which is Stussy. Stussy have for generations just had standout photo direction on everything. And a couple concepts there I'll share. The first is like the brand in action is just always just a no-brainer, where like you can show a model or you can show a person skating in the gear, and just like having that moment is just a pure separator for any brand that does have like a performance connection. Same with the lifestyle integration that you see here, where like they're in it, they're in the mud, literally. All the way to the simplicity of like, this dude's just living life in LA or Orange County or wherever they are. But like giving some everyday, the casualness of this is interesting inherently enough. And ties this overall Stussy idea of like, I've seen like 3 Stussy photos that are indoors. Like 90% of the photos, 99% of the photos are outside. You are catching some rays when you are in Stussy. And that is an important part of an overall theme of the brand that's carried through in almost every component you see in their art. Even this as just as a conceptual shot. You think about location and what you can do and what you can do on a budget. This is a great one. And then one of my favorite recent ones is they're just basically, they shot all these models in between 2 vehicles, and the vehicles change pretty regularly. And what I love about this is you can't see enough of it to really know what the vehicles are if you want to look or get more info. They're different each time, and the vehicles themselves just cause you to look in and be more interested in it, while still framing this like important subject in like a very like classic photo lineup. This is just a great shoot concept and idea. I think they executed amazingly. Another one, back to that initial Erde shot where the head was coming out of the wall, like the person emerging from the hole, whatever it is, like it could be a contrived photo. Like obviously he's not living down there and coming out, but it makes you think about what that implied story is that's happening. Rolling through some other concepts. This one from Kappa is really interesting, like presenting it like a team photo for their model shoot is a really cool and fun idea. Some of the ideas about how you can do things kind of in post, but again, it's just a singular concept applied to like a brand launch. This Alexander Wang shot and this like amorphous object that's included, like back to the one thing idea. If you have a studio shot, it's like, what's the one thing I could bring in? Like, let's bring in the silver orb or whatever it is. At the end of the day, like you get a couple guys, you can probably make this at Home Depot in a day. Like, what is this thing that we could create that could be a centerpiece of something we do in studio is like a surefire winner. Same thing with this, with like signage, like anything you can get where you actually get a sign with your brand name or you get something reusable like this, just like turns this studio photo shoot into something that can immediately be more compelling, and you can have a bunch of variations you try. Actually, another good example of like if you have a budget on a studio shoot and you're like, what are we going to spend our $1,000 on, our $4,000 on, whatever it is, like, all right, cool, we're going to get tons of stuffed animals and we're going to have them dropping and we're going to have someone on a mound of them, whatever it is. Like that ability to basically say we have X amount of funds, what are the things we can do with it, is just a key way to think about how you're doing your shoots, and then just have tons of references like these and be like, all right, let's go to the store and figure it out. I think the selfie is a awesome vehicle to turn any photo different, where all of a sudden the perspective is someone's showing themselves off, which is just an intrinsic concept to look at differently when you're like, what about the thing that they're wearing makes it so they feel comfortable enough to show themselves off, is an immediate thought that's transferred to the audience. And then this backdrop scenario here as well, where if you do studio and you could comp things in behind it, making an interesting contrast, and there's so many options here now with like what you can then create in Midjourney in the background, is a great way, in my opinion, to approach like getting the most out of a studio shoot versus just putting the person on the white background. In other simple concepts, like the single bug, like the presentation of a menu in a common way that you'd actually see it out there in the street. One of my favorites is like the interruption of spaces. Like this is an excellent shoe shot, and you could do a lot with tables, things like that, of like, it's disrespectful. It showcases the product super well. It draws you in and tells a story. It's about putting things in environments where they're less comfortable. Another one is excellent shot where like interaction with food, I feel like in general is probably one of the key things here, where like anything plus food, especially if it's not normally around food, is just such a plus. Whereas like with this, for example, like it's not only it's food, it's a unorthodox interaction with food, the same the last photo was. It's showing off the actual glove here, and that's one of those things that, again, this is a $100 idea. Post-production, simple ideas. This is what I like, where they just pixelated this car. It's a simple photo besides that, but that gives it everything you need to know that like something's happening. Another one here where if you were shooting a model like this and then putting these in here in like Midjourney, but this idea that you're like putting someone in a really uncomfortable scenario, and you're able to surround a subject with things that are like inherently complex. Those, again, objects presented in uncommon areas, like the ring when you're opening up a CD player, like it doesn't make sense long enough to catch attention, which could be the simplicity of something. Same thing with attaching stuff to more viral stuff. This is for the actual lip kit we have here, but like the tooth gem makes the photo. Back to the brand we showed before, Bloom, a good example that they basically just blowing the product up. And I like this. This is a useful one where I people that just blow the product up for the sake of it being viral is one thing, but they were announcing a bigger size, like a second variation, like then it becomes like that much more, makes that much more sense. And then the idea of like presenting your brand in context. So I like when you're just looking to, we need to create more content, do more things, like Saint Laurent over the matcha in context, like that existing, it's less about selling that individual item, if that's even an item they sell, and more about like the brand in context. Also this idea of the absence of something, like what you can do in post-production with that person without the head, etc. And then the action of what people are doing, like in the easiest ones that basically any brand could apply to shoot for cheap is food interaction. Games is another great one. This is an advertisement for a bag, like including the chest, the model like barely in the photo. Excellent shot. I made this idea of like, okay, what can we do in post-production, like put things on screens or make it so it's got this inherent like digital feel. Just the idea of composition. That's an immediate theory. If you have nothing else going, but you are at a location with models or showing off your product, what can you do from a composition standpoint to stand out? This is a great example of that, both from like where they have the model located to like, is this the same person or a second person, to the fact that that's out of focus. There's a lot about that photo that is meant to draw somebody in. And then pattern, whether done afterwards in post or done in how you shoot it, is a great one that immediately draws the eye on social. Another fun jewelry example, but that use of common things you have around there, and like what can you do to make it inherently complicated with 4 hands instead of 1. I love this, just interaction of elements and things. A good exercise when people say we don't have a budget for a shoot, I like to do is like list out everything strange or weird that any person in your team has, or that you have in your office, or that we may have access to. Like going and buying a fish in a bag is like a very easy option for that. And all the way up to like angle and location and the things you can do like within your toolkit, like as a photographer or a creative, to say we have a completely normal scenario, but we could put a person in a perspective that makes it interesting. To how you display the product. There's one thing I like about those blanked hangers, which I'm gonna use a lot in my stuff, is like by merely buying the hanger, and yeah, the hanger's $30 a hanger or whatever it is, your photo is gonna stand out. And it's the same thing for like this winch and display here. And then I love this idea of having something concealed or making something a secret, is for any small item, is just an interesting way to portray it. And then there's the like displaying photo with other photo, and whether it's a similarity in here or creating like an inherent contrast. Come back to something we talked about earlier with the interaction of people. Like one of the most important things when you have 2 people on a shoot is what are they gonna do together? And I think there is any amount of contact makes it interesting. And something like this, obviously, if someone's jumping over somebody or someone's headbutting someone, or there's a handshake, or, you know, like there's a punch or whatever it is that implies an action, or someone feeding another person, just gives it like an innate difference between 2 people just staring at the camera. And like that whole toolkit is a big part of how you can make those shoots stick. So anyway, that was 100 examples of different art direction styles. I breezed through them relatively quick because really I just want to give you a toolkit of how someone thinks about this when they're applying it. A reference point you can go look at in your brand, and just examples of a lot of quality art direction, because there is so much out there, and yet there's so many brands that still don't do it. And I think your role as a creative, as someone with a brand, and working in this, is to bring that out of how you're working and make something interesting. I'll probably do a deeper dive, like second video on this at some point in the future. So if you have like art direction questions or ideas or thoughts, please drop them in the comments and we'll get to them. Thanks for watching.